What's going on right now in the world of executive pay?
How big is the gap now between top CEOs' pay and average employees?
Just a staggering shift. It's a moral issue, too.
Legally, they're entitled to this pay. Morally, perhaps not so.
Is CEO compensation out of control?
With corporate executives earning millions of dollars, while many people struggle to pay the mortgage or put food on the table, the financial crisis has spotlighted inflated CEO compensation. Did you know the average pay of a CEO from an S&P 500 index company can support 8 Nobel Prize winners, 25 university presidents, 28 U.S. presidents, 178 nurses, 213 police officers, 225 teachers, 753 minimum wage earners. Richard Bernstein, book critic for The New York Times and foreign correspondent for Time magazine, writes, "If you're like me, the hot-button issue of exorbitant pay for corporate executives is mainly a moral one, a matter of values. Those bloated pay packages of American CEOs illustrated what might be called the plutocratization of American life, a glorification of money as the chief ingredient of success. Executive pay in 2004 was 431 times the pay of the average worker, and in the decade before 2005, executive pay increased 5 times faster than the pay of the ordinary employee of that company. The figures were even starker when CEO compensation was compared to that of people trying to survive on the minimum wage. In a 2006 report, the Democrats on the House committee wrote, "An average CEO makes more before lunch on his first day of work than a minimum wage earner will make all year." Is there something unethical about flying around in a private jet while thousands go to sleep hungry? Is there a point where one's wages are so high as to be considered obscene? What do you think?
We're here today to discuss something that has stirred a large amount of controversy within recent years. This is the issue of executive compensation. We need to ask the question regarding if executives should be receiving such large amounts of pay like they have been. There are those who think that it should be attempted to be regulated, but those who think that there is no reason to try at all. For example, we have the housing market collapse that gives reason to think that the pay of executives should be regulated to an extent. However, the government has attempted to regulate executive pay in the past, and companies have continuously found loopholes to get around the laws that the government passed that meant to resolve this problem. With me today, I have John and Nick to help dissect this issue and talk about the reasons as to why executive compensation should or should not be regulated. John believes that it should be, while Nick believes otherwise. So gentlemen, who would like to share their side first?
Thanks, Lorenzo. I would just like to say that I certainly believe that executive compensation should be regulated. I see no reason as to why some top CEOs for certain companies should receive the amount of pay that they do. One reason why this is a huge issue today is because there is an increasing number of families in the United States that are forced to support their families on minimum wage pay. Why should one CEO should receive a wage equivalent to that of 753 minimum wage workers? The housing market collapse in 2007-2008 is what made this issue arise in the first place, and it should be enough to show that there must be some form of change made. It should be easy for anyone to recognize the substantial amount of pay that top executive officers have made in these recent years, especially with how incentive pay is given out. Looking at the difference between the pay of a CEO and that of a typical worker who earns minimum wage, it seems like common sense to conclude that it is just unfair. If one is concerned with the well-being of the majority of American citizens, then it is safe to say the right thing to do is cut down this massive gap and distribute the wealth to those who actually need it.
Thank you, John. You have a good point. I'll step aside for a minute while you two discuss this a bit. So, Nick, what do you think?
Well, for starters, the United States government has a history of attempting to regulate this type of executive pay. These regulations have resulted in less effective arrangements and has increased costs on shareholders. On top of that, companies have found loopholes in the legislation that have allowed them to continue to receive these outrageous wages. Past restrictions and regulations have not worked out. So if we have a history of failed restrictions, why continue to attempt to restrict their pay?
Well, even if there's a history of failed attempts within this topic, why should we stop there? This is still a huge issue today, especially with the increasing number of families who are forced to support themselves with minimal pay. Even if we have failed in these past attempts, that does not mean we shouldn't seek out new opportunities to fix this problem. For example, we could take a different approach to regulate executives' pay. We could be focusing on the incentive structure of the pay and the options given to executives that are in their contracts. Take golden parachutes as an example. These are benefits given to top executives if the company is taken over by another firm and the executives are terminated as a result. Why is the government allowing payment to executives whose contracts are being terminated? Some of the potential payments to executives are overly excessive. An example of this would be the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, who stands to receive nearly $9 million if there is a change in control of the company and more than $50 million if she is terminated. All I'm trying to say is that there is an excessive amount of options available to executives in order to receive this excessive pay. And within these options, it's easy to see that the payout is higher than it should be. $50 million for terminated contract is completely unnecessary, so we should be focusing on these incentive clauses and payout options so that some of this wealth could be given to the people who actually need it.
But look, hasn't the federal government already attempted to regulate these golden parachutes? In 1982, the government passed Section 280G, which was meant to reduce the generosity of these parachutes, right? But in turn actually increased these payments. These new rules allowed for companies to introduce golden parachutes when they previously had no change in control agreement. Because this legislation only applies to severance payments contractually tied to changes in control, companies could go around it at a huge potential cost to shareholders. By making payments available to all terminated executives, not just those being terminated by change in control. This is just one of several examples where there is government has attempted, but without success, to regulate pay of executives. Because of this, it is pointless to even to attempt to regulate their payments, because the past has proved to be unsuccessful. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the knowledge you have blessed us with today. But let's stop it there and look further into some of the reasons that you both have brought up. John, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Nicholas, always a pleasure.
Thanks, fam.
All right, so I'm here with Bobby to talk about the issue of executive compensation and the debate about whether or not it should be regulated.
Here's just 3 quick facts to introduce you to the topic a little bit more. The first one here, current day CEOs at America's largest firms earn 3 times the amount of pay than they did 20 years ago and 10 times the amount of pay than they did 30 years ago. Second fact, between the years 1978 to 2014, inflation-adjusted CEO compensation increased 997% compared to the 10.9% growth in typical workers' compensation during the same time. And the last fact here, CEO pay grew faster than the pay of the top 1/10% of wage earners, meaning that CEO pay does not reflect greater productivity of executives, but rather the power of CEOs to extract concessions. Here we're just talking about some types of compensation that we were talking about in the prior slide. The first form of compensation is being cash alone. The second one being option grants. Those are just options that are granted to executives in a general sense. Then we have deferred compensation. This is compensation that has been deferred until a later date for tax purposes. The fourth one here, long-term incentive plans. These encompass all compensation that is tied to performance in a work-related sense. Then we have retirement packages, the fifth one. This contains the golden parachutes, which are benefits given to top executives if the company is taken over by another firm and terminated as a result. And then the final one here, we have executive perks. This relates to various perks given to executives, such as use of a private jet, reimbursement for their travels, stuff like that. Move on to the next one here. And we want to ask the question, are these benefits being taken advantage of? Some executives have been caught in the past overusing their privileges, such as driving lessons for their children, personal nannies, buying cars. These examples all show that options should be regulated because this type of greed is likely to bankrupt smaller companies or contribute to deficits. And then here we talk about some incentive structures. Incentive to provide stored information, which would do the following. Raise stock prices. As a result, higher stock prices meant increased compensation. These structures would lead to distorted and misleading information. And then the last point there, quantity versus quality, that just talks about problems when those being paid are paid on quantity over quality, when it is the market where quality is more so important. It's stressed more in this type of scenario. Just a little bit more about incentive structures. Encouraged excessive risk-taking, a predatory behavior on those who are ill-informed. Incentive structures encouraged distortions in the provisions of information. Poorly designed incentives led to the deterioration of product quality. And then here we just talk about some apparent incentives. Providing distorted information would result in higher stock prices, and banks excelled at this, moving stocks off balance sheets, for example. Markets only work well with good info, so the bank's incentive structures encouraged the provision of distorted and misleading information. Not surprisingly, the quality deteriorated markedly, with more effort put into quantity over quality if pay is based on quantity. And now we have some visual images to help you get a better picture of what's going on here, so I'm going to pass this back to John.
Okay, so we can see here that over the years, CEO compensation wasn't really a major factor until late 90s, early 2000s, and then it slowly started to dip down as the stock market fell in the early 2000s, but then it made a comeback over the mid-2000s and then fell again during the stock market crisis of 2008-2009. And so we can just see that here in number form. So it fell and then slowly started increasing again. But if you notice that it's still in the double-digit millions amount of dollars that CEO compensation have been receiving. And then, so if we look at 2009, 2010, 2011, 2009 it was about 10.5 million, and then it slowly started increasing again. If we look at 2014, it's back up to 16 million. So pay was high when performance was good prior to 2008, 2009, and then after 2008, 2009, it's continued to increase. And then we can see here the CEO to worker compensation ratio over the years that it has also slowly started to increase and fell at the same time that the stock market did, and hitting its peak at 376.1 to 1 compared to CEO to worker compensation.
So after seeing all the data, we want to ask the question, should anything be done? After seeing these statistics, many people believe that an effort should be made to change this trend among executive pay.
However, the failures in the past show that there is no clear solution to the problem at hand. This explains why there hasn't been many present efforts to attempt to regulate executive pay.
And therefore, the debate continues, and if there's any changes to be made, it isn't expected to be made for some time.